Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Ahmedabad Management Association, it's a real pleasure to welcome you on this Sunday morning talk, a very, very interesting talk, Rediscovering the Freedom Fighter Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose, his ideals for a modern India, by none other than Sugata Bose, who is the Gardiner Professor of History at the Harvard University. And as many of you are aware, he's been delivering talks for the past 2 days in different forums and institutions in Ahmedabad, and is very much part of the Bose family, grandson of Sharat Chandra Bose. Before he delivers his talk, I'll give a brief introduction about this highly accomplished academician and a person. Before that, I'll just remind you to put your phones on a silent mode or switch them off. And as our usual AMA format, after his talk, we'll have a few minutes for brief questions, but they should be relevant to today's topic, not general questions, please. So, Sugata Bose is the Gardiner Professor of History at the Harvard University. Mr. Bose has served as a Director of Graduate Studies in History at Harvard and as the founding director of Harvard South Asia Institute. Bose was educated at Presidency College, Calcutta and University of Cambridge, where he obtained his PhD. His scholarship has contributed to a deeper understanding of colonial and post-colonial political economy, the relation between rural and urban domains, inter-regional arenas of travel, trade, and imagination across the Indian Ocean, and Indian ethical discourses, political philosophy, and economic thought. You'll agree that as children, when we think of freedom fighters, it's Subhash Chandra Bose has always been there with stalwarts like Mahatma Gandhi and many others. And there are so many stories we have read in articles, magazines, books, and there's a lot of research done, but anyway, I'll leave all that to the expert. Dr. Bose's many books include 100 Horizons, the Indian Ocean in the Age of Global Empire, published at Cambridge by Harvard University Press in 2006, Modern South Asia, History, Culture, Political Economy, written with Aisha Jalal, published in 2011, and His Majesty's Opponent, Subhash Chandra Bose and India's Struggle Against Empire, again published by the Bacall Press at the Harvard University Press. Then he has served as the chair of the Presidency Mentor Group, advising on the rejuvenation of Presidency University as a world-class center of excellence and a member of the Nalanda Governing Board. At the invitation of the Mamata Banerjee, Chief Minister of West Bengal, he agreed to contest the 16th Lok Sabha elections from the prestigious Jadavpur parliamentary constituency that was in 2014, and he won his parliamentary election by a margin of 1,25,000 votes. Dr. Bose, it's a real pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the audience and AMA. I welcome you with a bouquet. Over to Dr. Subhata Bose, please. Yes.
Good morning. It's a true privilege to be able to come and speak at the Ahmedabad Management Association, an organization founded by none other than Vikram Sarabhai. And thank you for the warm welcome that you have given me this morning. Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose is best remembered as a warrior hero, but he was a warrior who paused between battles to reflect on India's past and the global future. And so today, I want to give you some inkling of what his vision was for the building of a modern India after independence. With World War II raging across Europe and Asia, An American journalist, Louis Fisher, had come to see Mahatma Gandhi in early June 1942. The young American was puzzled by the Indian reluctance to line up unambiguously on the side of the Allies and against the Axis powers. Hosted for a week in Gandhi's ashram in Sevagram near Wardha, Fisher had a series of very candid conversations with the Mahatma. There were powerful elements of fascism, Gandhi told his interlocutor, in British India, and these were the elements that India encountered on a daily basis. Your president, Gandhiji continued, talks about the four freedoms. Do they include the freedom to be free? In the course of their conversations, Louis Fisher asked Gandhiji about a man who had escaped the clutches of the British in 1941 and was now ready to raise the flag of Indian independence abroad. In his response, Gandhiji described Subhas Chandra Bose as a patriot among patriots, albeit misguided. What Fisher learned about Subhas Chandra Bose from Khurshid Ben, who was deputed by Gandhiji to take care of his guest, was even more revealing. Khurshid Nauroji was the granddaughter of Dadabhai Nauroji. For the last 15 years, she had been a constant disciple of Gandhiji, the apostle of nonviolence. If Bose entered India at the head of an Indian army, Khurshid Ben told Fisher, he could rally the whole country. Bose, according to this feisty 40-year-old woman, was, quote, more popular than Nehru and in certain circumstances had a stronger appeal than Gandhi, unquote. When the sun rose on July 5, 1943, over the Singapore harbour, it was the proudest day in Subhas's life. He appeared looking resplendent in a simple khaki military uniform on the balcony of Singapore's green-domed municipal building, flanked by its majestic Corinthian columns. The soldiers of the Indian National Army stood in front of him on the padang, the expanse of green that stretched from the steps of the city hall towards the sea. George Washington of America could fight and win freedom, he told the vanguard of India's struggle, because he had his army. Garibaldi could liberate Italy because he had his armed volunteers behind him. History had taught him the lesson of the inexorable decline and fall of empires. He and the pioneers of the Indian National Army were standing on what had once been a bulwark and now was a graveyard of the British Empire. How many of us will individually survive this war of freedom, he said in a somber warning. I do not know. But I do know this, that we shall ultimately win, and our task will not end until our surviving heroes hold the victory parade on another graveyard of the British Empire, the Lal Killa, or Red Fortress of ancient Delhi. The victory parade at the Red Fort came to be enacted in a most unusual way. When the Second World War ended, the Indian independence movement seemed in disarray. The Quit India movement launched by Mahatma Gandhi in August 1942 had been crushed. Netaji's armed thrust from outside India's borders had been repulsed. The British charged a Hindu, a Muslim and a Sikh, Prem Saigal, Shahnawaz Khan and Gurbakh Singh Dhillon, with high treason for waging war against the King Emperor. The whole country has been roused, Gandhiji observed, and even the regular forces have been stirred into a new political consciousness and have begun to think in terms of independence. The man whom Netaji had been the first to hail as the father of our nation now regarded his rebellious son as a prince among patriots. Netaji's name, Gandhiji said, is one to conjure with. His patriotism is second to none. The lesson that Netaji and his army brings to us, the Mahatma wrote in the Harijan on February 12, 1946, is one of self-sacrifice, unity, irrespective of class and community, and discipline. As the drama unfolded in the winter of 1945 and the spring of 1946, Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose commanded in absentia the denouement of the plot. Indians have never had any difficulty in combining reverence for saints with admiration for warrior heroes. The sword of the warrior, an early 20th century nationalist had asserted, is as necessary to the fulfillment of justice and righteousness as the holiness of the saint. The conquering hero, whose name was on everyone's lips, did not make an appearance on the stage at the climax. Netaji had been reported killed in a crash of a Japanese bomber in Taipei on August 18, 1945. "You will understand our pressing anxiety," a British intelligence officer wrote on February 19, 1946, "to get to the truth of whether Bose is actually and permanently dead." If British imperialists wanted him permanently dead, most people in India wished exactly the opposite and longed for him to be permanently alive. As he became shrouded in myth and mystery, a great deal was lost in terms of a genuine understanding of who he was as a human being and his place in history. Yet his life was in important ways greater and certainly as fascinating as the legend. His political career, traversing complex international itineraries, required a constant negotiation of the global forces of imperialism and nationalism, fascism and communism. His life, in that sense, encapsulated all of the dramatic contradictions of world history in the first half of the 20th century. 7 days before his assassination on January 30th, 1948, Gandhiji had been very glad to take note of Subhas's birthday, even though he generally did not remember such dates, and the deceased patriot believed in violence while he was wedded to non-violence. Subhas, according to the Mahatma, knew no provincialism nor communal differences, and had in his brave army men and women drawn from all over India without distinction, and evoked affection and loyalty which very few have been able to evoke. It was on January 23rd in the year 1897 that Subhas was born at the high noon of the Raj. He would devote his life towards ensuring that the sun did finally set on the British Empire. India, Subhas wrote to his mother in 1912, when he was only 15 years old, is God's beloved land. His discovery of India, unlike Jawaharlal Nehru's, occurred very early in his life. As the letters to his mother reveal, his love for the country was at this stage tinged with a religious sensibility and expressed as devotion to the mother. Yet he was dismayed at the current state of both the country and of religion. Now, wherever religion is practiced, there is so much bigotry and sin, he wrote. He asked his own mother, "Will the condition of our country continue to go from bad to worse? Will not any son of Mother India in distress, in total disregard of his selfish interests, dedicate his whole life to the cause of the mother?" After graduating from Calcutta University in 1919, Subhas set out to study philosophy in Cambridge and qualify for the Indian civil service. The letters to his elder brother, Chandra Bose, from England during 1921 reveal what went through his mind as he moved towards the decision to resign from what many regarded as the heaven-born service. He chose to chuck this rotten service and not to wear the emblem of servitude, as national and spiritual aspirations were not compatible with obedience to civil service conditions. Only on the soil of sacrifice and suffering, Subhas declared, can we raise our national edifice. If the members of the services withdraw their allegiance or even show a desire to do so, he reckoned, then and then only will the bureaucratic machine collapse. Having completed his Cambridge degree in philosophy, Subhas set sail for India with an unwavering sense of mission to serve his country's cause. He landed in Bombay on July 16, 1921, and rushed to see Gandhiji the same afternoon. On the Mahatma's advice, Subhas hastened by train to Calcutta in order to report for duty to Deshabandhu Chittaranjan Das, the towering Congress leader from Bengal, with whom he had corresponded from Cambridge. When his mentor, C.R. Das, passed away in 1925, Subhas, then a prisoner in Mandalay, felt desolate with a sense of bereavement. The exile in Burmese prisons until 1927 witnessed the transformation of a lieutenant to a leader. He had come to regard Tyaga and Amrita, renunciation and realization, as two faces of the same medal. In a long letter to Sharot on April 4, 1927, he explained why, despite being seriously ill, he was going to reject the government's offer of indefinite European exile. If he had the remotest intention of becoming a Bolshevik agent, he would have jumped at it and joined the gay band from Paris to Leningrad, talking of world revolution and emitting blood and thunder in their utterances. He was not inclined in that direction. He could not persuade himself that permanent exile from his homeland would be better than life in a jail leading to the sepulchre. Ideas are the stuff of which human movements are made, he passionately proclaimed, and they are not static but dynamic and militant. They are as dynamic as the absolute idea of Hegel, the blind will of Hartmann and Schopenhauer, and the élan vital of Henri Bergson. A life consecrated to ideas was bound to fulfill itself. He then invoked St. Paul's famous words, "We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of the world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." Subhas had unflinching faith in the ultimate triumph of the ideas for which he stood. In the late 1920s and the early 1930s, Bose emerged alongside Nehru as the leader of the left-leaning younger generation of anti-colonial nationalists. Between further spells in prison, he led the student, youth, and labor movements. Democracy, he asserted in 1928, is by no means a Western institution. It is a human institution. He wanted India to become an independent federal republic, and he advocated cultural intimacy among India's different communities. He also warned Indian nationalists not to become a queer mixture of political democrats and social conservatives, and called for the fullest rights of three large communities: the women, the so-called depressed classes, and the laboring masses. At a time when the elders, including Gandhiji, sought dominion status, Subhas called for complete independence. Once that was adopted as the goal of the Congress, he wanted the Congress to set up a parallel government. He was elected mayor of Calcutta in between being in prison in 1931, but then spent the entire year 1932 again in various jails taking part in Gandhiji's civil disobedience movement. On February 13, 1933, Subhas was carried in an ambulance to the port in Bombay and released from detention only after he was put on board a ship sailing for Europe. Vienna, the dazzling center of a sprawling multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian empire, had been reduced at the end of World War I to being the capital of a small, landlocked, agrarian nation-state. It was to this beautiful and angst-ridden city by the Danube that Subhas came in March 1933 as a political exile, seeking a cure from the illness that had beset him in colonial prisons, and hoping to promote, along with Vithalbhai Patel, his country's freedom struggle in Europe. Despite his recurring health problems, he would travel tirelessly for the next 3 years, inspiring Indian students studying abroad, establishing associations to promote friendship between India and various European countries, and meeting opinion makers and leaders of governments wherever possible to win their support for Indian independence. He wanted Indians overseas to serve as unofficial ambassadors of their enslaved country and set a personal example by becoming the Doyen among them. These years witnessed the transformation of a radical leader into an international statesman. Czechoslovakia and Poland were two Central and East European countries of special interest to Bose. He carefully studied the formation of a Czechoslovak legion during World War I with British and Russian help to win freedom from Austrian domination, and a Polish legion with Japanese help to throw off the Russian yoke. He would cite these examples years later of weaker nations needing the help of stronger ones to win independence when he formed the Indian National Army during World War II. When he returned briefly to India in December 1934, on hearing the news of his father's illness, the airport in Calcutta was surrounded by police, and as soon as he stepped off the plane, Subhas was served an order of home internment. And this is a photograph that my father, as a 14-year-old, took during Subhas while he was participating in the Shraddha ceremony of his father. Bose's book, The Indian Struggle, his interpretation of the freedom movement from 1920 to 34, was published in London in January 1935. The colonial government in Delhi, with the approval of London, lost no time in proscribing the book. Despite the hostility of the British government, the Indian struggle was particularly well reviewed by the British press. The year 1935 was dominated by his own illness, including a major surgery, and a long drawn-out convalescence. He then readied himself for another European tour in early 1936. He was denied a visa to go to the Soviet Union, but that was compensated by the permit he was granted to visit Ireland. His first act on disembarking at Cork was to pay a floral tribute at the grave of Terence MacSweeney, the former mayor who had died after a hunger strike against the British authorities. Subhas Bose regarded his 2 weeks in Ireland as the political high point of his European sojourn. De Valera warmly received him and held several meetings with him. After 3 years in Europe, Subhas Chandra Bose gave his own assessment of Italy and Germany in public and private prior to his departure for India. To an Indian nationalist, German policy rankled even more than Italy's misadventures. Against Germany, we Indians have many complaints, he wrote to the poet Omiyo Chakravarti. Against Italy, there are complaints from other standpoints, not from the standpoint of India's interest or prestige. But against Germany, we have many accusations from India's standpoint. If these were the views expressed in private to an Indian friend, he was equally forthright in his communications on this subject with his principal German interlocutor and in press interactions. He told Franz Thierfelder of the Deutsche Academy that he was returning to India with the conviction that the new nationalism of Germany was not only narrow and selfish, but arrogant. When we are fighting the greatest empire in the world for our freedom and for our rights, and when we are confident of our ultimate success, he declared, we cannot brook any insult from any other nation or any attack on our race or culture. Unbeknown to the world, the most difficult part of ending the days of European exile for Subhas was not the certainty of imprisonment in India, but the pain of separation from the woman he loved. Freed from the stifling Indian environment of social conventions, he had developed a close relationship with an Austrian woman, Emilie Schenkel. As he prepared to go home in March 1936, he wrote Emilie a letter. Even the iceberg sometimes melts, he began, and so it is with me now. He had already sold himself to his first love, his country, to whom he had to return. On a later visit to Bad Gastein, Austria, in December 1937, Subhas managed both to write 10 chapters of his unfinished autobiography and to secretly get married. Mahatma Gandhi had made known his choice of Subhas as the next president of the Congress in October 1937. And this was a portrait taken of him as president-elect in Prague, Czechoslovakia, in January 1938. The arrival in February of 1938 of a revolutionary leader from Bengal to preside over the 51st session of the Congress in Gujarat, the home province of the Apostle of Nonviolence, carried powerful symbolic meaning. The spectacle of Subhas Chandra Bose taken in a chariot pulled by 51 white bulls to the Congress venue in the rural setting of Haripura connected agrarian and urban India and evoked an idyllic past beckoning a dynamic future. Mahatma Gandhi and Subhas Chandra Bose in earnest conversation on the dais at the plenary session warmed the hearts of millions of Indians looking forward to a united nationalist stand against the Raj. Subhas Bose's lengthy and weighty presidential address articulated his vision of the climactic phase of the freedom struggle and the socio-economic reconstruction of free India. He began with an incisive analysis of the strength and weaknesses of the global edifice of British imperialism. While advocating cultural autonomy for the different linguistic areas, Subhas suggested accepting Hindustani, a blend of Hindi and Urdu, as the lingua franca. He wanted to allow the fullest latitude to the use of both the Devanagari and Arabic Persian scripts, but considered the adoption of the Roman script as the wisest solution in the long run. The ambition of unifying India through a strong central government had to be balanced, in his view, by the need, quote, to put all the minority communities as well as the provinces at their ease by allowing them a large measure of autonomy in cultural as well as governmental affairs, unquote. This vision was a stretch removed from the insistence on a monolithic nationalism by some of the other Congress leaders, including Nehru and Patel. Subhas Bose from the beginning believed that India's future depended on assuring the dignity of all minorities. Multiple identities, in his view, were not an obstacle in the way of achieving an overarching national unity. If India were prepared to fight for it, Bose was convinced that freedom would come in the foreseeable future. So he laid out a long-period program for a free India. So far as reconstruction after the devastation of colonial rule was concerned, the principal problem would be how to eradicate poverty from our country. That would require a radical reform of our land system, including the abolition of landlordism. The drying up of rural credit during the Depression had compounded the problem of peasant debt. Agricultural indebtedness, in Bose's view, would have to be liquidated and provision made for cheap credit for the rural population. There were limits, however, to focusing on agriculture. In order to solve the economic problem, agricultural improvement would not be enough, and an ambitious plan for industrial development would have to be crafted. However much we may dislike modern industrialism and condemn the evils which follow in its train, Subhas Bose declared, alluding to Gandhiji's concerns, we cannot go back to the pre-industrial era, even if we desire to do so. The existence of multiple parties and the democratic basis of the Congress Party, he said trustingly, would prevent the future Indian state becoming a totalitarian one. Inner party democracy would serve to ensure that leaders are not thrust upon the people from above, but elected from below. These were his words in 1938. Towards the end of his Haripura address, Subhas dealt with the foreign policy of a subject nation and urged the Congress to be poised to take advantage of the international situation. He made a strong case for extending India's soft power through vigorous cultural diplomacy. He wished to see trusted representatives of India appointed in all continents, near and distant. Ours is a struggle not only against British imperialism, but against world imperialism as well, of which the former is the keystone. We are therefore fighting not for the cause of India alone, but of humanity as well. India freed means humanity saved. As a first step to drawing up a blueprint for the socio-economic reconstruction of India, he convened a conference in May of the premiers of the 7 Congress provincial ministries in Bombay. The meeting discussed the challenges of industrial reconstruction, development of power resources, and coordination among the Congress-ruled provinces. Subhas's own priorities were made clear in a speech he gave to the Bombay municipality. A modern municipality, in his view, had to provide primary education and healthcare, with particular attention devoted to tackling the problems of infant mortality and maternity. Bose was also keen to plan ahead for the time when Indians would wield power at an all-India center. He held meetings with leaders of the scientific community and advocated a partnership between science and politics. He convened a conference of industries ministers of Congress-ruled provinces in Delhi on October 2nd, 1938, Mahatma Gandhi's birthday. The goal he set for the Congress was to see that everybody, man, woman, and child, is better clothed, better educated, and has sufficient leisure for recreation and for cultural activity. India, he noted, had resources similar to those of the United States of America. What was required was the intelligent and equitable utilization of these resources in the best interests of the nation. He did not see any necessary conflict between cottage industries and large-scale industries. He reassured Gandhi and Gandhians that he was firmly committed to developing cottage industries, but felt it was necessary to embrace the idea of industrialization. Subhas Bose set up the National Planning Committee, of which he invited Jawaharlal Nehru to be the chairman. In its first meeting in Bombay on December 17, 1938, Bose argued in his inaugural speech that there could be a symbiosis between state planning for heavy industries and private entrepreneurship in setting up light industries and stimulating the revival of cottage industries. He wanted the committee to pay urgent attention to the building of infrastructure, especially in power and communications. This is in 1938. He was quite ecumenical in the composition of the committee, choosing representatives of industry and labor and eminent persons from all walks of life. He picked his good friend Meghnad Shah, the scientist, but he also included J.C. Kumarappa, a Gandhian purist opposed to large-scale industrialization. As you all know, in January 1939, Subhas defeated Gandhiji's nominee in a contest to be re-elected Congress president. In his presidential address in March, he anticipated the outbreak of the Second World War and urged the Congress to issue a six-month ultimatum to the British to quit India. But there was a political tussle, and he handed in his resignation as Congress president at the end of April of 1939. He received unstinted support during this political crisis from Rabindranath Tagore, who hailed him as Deshanayak, the leader of the country, and expressed confidence that his temporary defeat would be turned into a permanent victory. When the Battle of Britain was raging over the skies of London in 1940, India's colonial masters had their most uncompromising opponent safely behind bars in the Presidency Jail of Calcutta. Subhas had other ideas, however. On November 29, 1940, he launched a hunger strike in prison, challenging the government, "Release me, or I shall refuse to live." "Nobody can lose through suffering and sacrifice," he had written on November 26, 1940, in his political testament addressed to the British governor of Bengal. "If he does lose anything of the earthy, he will gain much more by becoming an heir to a life immortal." Governor John Herbert decided to send him home on December 5, 1940, having resolved to rearrest him as soon as he had recovered his health. If he resorts to hunger strike again, Herbert blithely told Viceroy Linlithgow on December 11, 1940, the present cat-and-mouse policy will be continued, and its employment will serve both to render him innocuous and to make him realize that nothing is to be gained from a series of fasts. By that time, Subhas had already summoned his nephew, Shishir Kumar Bose, and asked him to help plan and execute his escape from India. "You are irrepressible, whether ill or well," Bapu wrote on December 29, 1940. "Do get well before going in for fireworks." But the rebel had already completed his preparations for his fireworks and was simply waiting for the right moment to light the fuse. On the night of January 16th, 17th, 1941, Subhas secretly left his home on Elgin Road in Calcutta, disguised as Muhammad Ziauddin, a North Indian Muslim insurance agent. He was driven by Shishir in a German-made Wanderer car to Gomo railway junction, some 200 miles away in the neighboring province of Bihar, now in Jharkhand. There, Subhas boarded the Delhi-Kalka mail for the capital, where he changed to the Frontier mail on his way to Peshawar. He was received there by a close political associate, Mia Akbar Shah, who arranged the next stage of his journey across the border of British India. Pretending to be a deaf and mute Pathan, still Muhammad Ziauddin, Subhas Chandra Bose trekked across the rugged terrain of the tribal territories of the northwest frontier, crossing the territorial limits of Britain's Indian Empire on January 26th and reaching Kabul on January 31st, 1941. His family announced in Calcutta on January 26th that he could not be found, leaving British intelligence officers shamefaced and bewildered. In a city that was an epicenter of international espionage, Subhas faced an agonizing wait for more than a month and a half. He desperately sought help from the Soviet, German, and Italian legations to get out of Afghanistan. The British successfully intercepted and decoded an Italian telegram on February 27, 1941, that suggested their elusive enemy may well be in Kabul. On March 7, 1941, the Special Operations Executive informed its representatives in Istanbul and Cairo that Bose was understood to be traveling from Afghanistan to Germany via Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, and asked them to wire what arrangements they could make for his assassination. In the event, Subhas did not take the Middle Eastern route. Having acquired the passport of an Italian diplomat, Orlando Mazzotta, he traveled across Soviet Central Asia to Moscow. Taking advantage of the German-Soviet pact then in force, he then flew from Moscow to Berlin on April 2, 1941. "You will be surprised to get this letter from me," he wrote to Emily, "and even more surprised to know that I am writing this from Berlin." There are certainly reasons to be surprised to find Subhas Chandra Bose in wartime Berlin. Why did the man who had espoused left-wing socialist views as Congress president chosen to come to Nazi Germany in 1941? The answer lay in the prison of war camps of Germany and Italy. Subhas had plunged into the Indian freedom movement led by Mahatma Gandhi in 1921. Yet, in the subsequent 2 decades of mass agitations against colonial rule, the soldiers in Britain's Indian Army had remained insulated from the swirling currents of civilian political discontent. They were the ones who were deployed wherever and whenever necessary to defend Britain's imperial interests worldwide. Netaji had made up his mind that at the climactic moment of India's anti-imperialist struggle, the loyalty of India's men-in-arms to the British King Emperor had to be replaced by a new allegiance to the cause of Indian independence. An international war crisis afforded him the opportunity to gain access to these soldiers being held by Britain's enemies. An armed thrust from outside India, coinciding with an uprising within, could bring about the final dissolution of the British Raj. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 put paid to Netaji's plans for an invasion from the northwest. The march of the German troops towards the east, he warned Ribbentrop on August 15, 1941, will be regarded as the approach not of a friend but of an enemy. He set up a Free India Centre with the help of Indian exiles and raised an Indian Legion. After the fall of Singapore on February 15, 1942, he started broadcasting to India. My allegiance and my loyalty has ever been and will ever be to India and India alone, he told his listeners, no matter in which part of the world I may live at any given time. He came out in strong support of Mahatma Gandhi once the Quit India movement was launched in August 1942. On November 29, 1942, his daughter Anita was born. Leaving a Bengali letter for his elder brother Sharat in the hands of his wife Emily on February 8, 1943, he boarded a U-boat at Kiel Harbour. Today, once again, he wrote, I am embarking on the path of danger, but this time towards home. I may not see the end of the road. In my absence, please show my wife and daughter the love that you have given me throughout your life. In one respect, the Cambridge historians Christopher Bailey and Tim Harper write of the war situation in 1943, the British had much to fear. Subhas Chandra Bose, their most resolute and resourceful Indian enemy, was on the move. There is a certain amount of risk, undoubtedly, in this undertaking, he had written on December 5th, 1942, about his impending submarine voyage. But so is there in every undertaking. That risk I shall gladly and voluntarily take. At the same time, I believe in my destiny, and I therefore believe that this endeavor will succeed. After a 90-day submarine voyage that included a transfer in a rubber raft from a German to a Japanese submarine in the Indian Ocean, Netaji arrived in Sabang in Sumatra. From there, he flew to Tokyo and back to Singapore, where he took over the leadership of the Indian independence movement and the Indian National Army on July 4th, 5th, 1943. In the months that followed, he electrified massive audiences of civilians and soldiers with his speeches. He gave his soldiers the slogan Chalo Delhi, reminiscent of the 1857 rebellion in India. On September 26, 1943, a ceremonial parade and prayers were held at the last Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah's tomb in Rangoon to signal the INA's determination to march to the Red Fort of Delhi. In fact, what he did in 1943 was a management miracle. He organized a large army of liberation. He raised funds. He called for total mobilization. And the nearly 3 million Indians spread out all over Southeast and East Asia came forward to respond to his calls. Women would come to his mass meetings, take off their jewelry, and put them in his hands. There were some very rich Indians who overnight became fakirs. In Rangoon, there was a Gujarati Muslim, Abdul Habib Sahab, who gave up his entire fortune so that India could be free. On October 21st, 1943, Netaji proclaimed the formation of the Azad Hind government in Singapore. He wrote the proclamation himself well past midnight on October 19th, 20th, 1943, drawing on Indian history and elements of the Irish and American declarations of independence. In January 1944, the headquarters of the government were moved forward from Singapore to Rangoon. Having first seen action on the Arakan front in February 1944, the INA moved into northeastern India towards Imphal and Kohima on March 18, 1944. With Chalo Delhi on their lips and singing Kadam Kadam Badhaya, the INA crossed the Indo-Burma frontier and carried the armed struggle onto Indian soil. The promised march to Delhi was, however, halted in Imphal. The British and Britain's Indian Army, with American air support, were able to break the siege of Imphal after 3.5 tense months and beat back the Japanese forces and the INA from the outskirts of Kohima as well. Away from the battlefield, Netaji found one last occasion to give his views on the fundamental problems of India when he was invited to address the faculty and students of Tokyo University in November 1944. He argued in what has come to be called his Tokyo thesis that the creative faculty of its people and their determination to resist imperialist domination gave ample proof of India's vitality as a nation. He dwelt skillfully on the theme of Indian modernity and offered finely etched assessments of Mahatma Gandhi and Rabindranath Tagore. He was able to delineate with clarity for a foreign audience what he thought would be the three most urgent tasks facing free India. 1. National defense. 2. Eradication of poverty. And 3. Provision of education for all. An international order, he argued, could only be built on the foundation of associations of regional cooperation. Citing the failure of the League of Nations, he urged Japan as the sponsor nation of Asian regionalism to, quote, avoid a selfish and short-sighted policy and work on a moral basis, unquote. The military setback in Imphal in late 1944 was followed by a retreat speckled with a few determined rearguard actions by the INA in Burma during late 1944 and early 1945. It was Netaji's historic retreat with the soldiers of the Indian National Army and the women of the Rani of Jhansi Regiment from Burma to Thailand, a dangerous trek under constant military fire from the enemy in April and May 1945, that left an indelible imprint on popular memory about the sacrifices made by these warriors to pay the price of freedom. The atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August 1945 brought the war in East Asia to an abrupt end. On August 15, 1945, exactly 2 years before India's independence, Netaji issued his last order of the day and a special message to Indians in East Asia. The roads to Delhi are many, he told his soldiers, and Delhi still remains our goal. Urging his civilian followers never to falter in their faith in India's destiny, Netaji expressed confidence that India shall be free and before long. 3 days later, on August 18, 1945, Netaji met his mortal end as he tried to continue the battle for India's freedom. In this mortal world, everything perishes and will perish, Subhas Chandra Bose had written in 1940 as he went on his hunger strike. But ideas, ideals, and dreams do not. As he prepared for his fast unto death, he was confident that the idea for which one individual was prepared to die would incarnate itself in 1,000 lives. That, he believed, was how the wheels of evolution turned, and the ideas, ideals, and dreams of one generation were bequeathed to the next. No idea has ever fulfilled itself in this world, he asserted, except through an ordeal of suffering and sacrifice. It is his immense sacrifice in the sense of tyag, as taught by Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, and kurbani, as enshrined on the INA memorial for which he laid a foundation stone in Singapore, that has made him an heir to a life immortal. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Dr. Sugata Bose. It was such a pleasure to listen to the finer aspects of some of the landmark moments of Subhas Chandra Bose's life, and such, foresight, ideals for the future, finer aspects, what he had about, aspects like, the balance of the cottage industry and the large industry, the well-being of the citizens of the future, the role of the public and the private sector in those days also, he could think of. And as I mentioned now, we'll be taking a few questions. But before that, I'd like to mention and thank Mr. Nitin Bhai Shukla. Please stand up, sir. Who, because of him, Dr. Sugata Bose is here. And Ajay, will you have the mic for the questions, please? So we can have questions one by one. You can take it from there. Please make sure that your questions are brief, basically. Thank you, friends. Yeah, please.
Hello. Yeah. There's a famous proclamation which is, he to Tomi amake rakta deo, ami tomake mukti de, like this, you give me blood and I will give you freedom. When he said this?
Heroes shape history, and heroes are also shaped by history. I think that Subhas Chandra Bose's experience is very much different from Gandhi's experience, number one. You are dealing with his ideals of modern India. I would say that Subhas Bose was very much influenced by Raja Ram Mohan Rai and his Renaissance movement. How many Indians now are ready to accept Raja Ram Mohan Rai as father of modern India, number one. Subhas Chandra Bose equally influenced by Swami Vivekananda, also by Banga Andolan, and also by activities, revolutionary activities in France and England. Madam Bikhaiji Kama, Samji Krishna Verma. I would say that if Gandhi was the father of modern India, Subhas Chandra Bose was the father of Indian martyrs. I label him like that because he is the last revolutionary who lays down his life, as you pointed out, for the sake of Indian freedom. I call him father of Indian martyrs who laid that down the life. These are the historical influences. I think that see the language of Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi's language and Subhas Chandra. I would like to study language of Sardar Patel, Gandhi and Subhas Chandra Bose. Experience is different in Eastern India and in Western India. Now last point. Eastern India produced Raja Ram Mohan Rai, a great Renaissance, father of Renaissance man, and Western India produced Sahajanand Swami, a great moral teacher, contemporary. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you. You know, there is no record that is definitive of Netaji having said, "Give me blood and I will give you freedom." In one transcript of a speech that he made in Bangkok, which was printed, these words appear at the very end. In another speech, he is reported to have said, "The goddess of liberty demands, give me blood and I will give you freedom," which is a very different formulation from, the sentence which is popularly reported to have been a proclamation by Netaji. Now, obviously, he called for a great deal of sacrifice in order to pay the price for India's freedom. But we have to be careful in figuring out what exactly he said in his speeches as the leader of the Azad Hind movement. Yes, of course, there were many differences between Mahatma Gandhi and Subhas Chandra Bose, and Mahatma Gandhi had a much more thoroughgoing critique of modernity, including modern industrial civilization, the Western forms of parliamentary democratic institutions, and so on. And Subhas Chandra Bose, of course, was a product of the Bengal Renaissance, of which the father was Ram Mohan Roy, and he was very close to the modern Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore in his own time. But as I pointed out in my Sabarmati lecture the day before yesterday, there was a lot that was common between Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose as well. And despite their differences, their relationship was characterized by deep love, affection, and respect. And in one way, they were very similar. And that was in their commitment to unite the different religious communities of India, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians, in the cause of Indian freedom. And Netaji's success in the Azad Hind Fauj in achieving that unity was what hugely impressed Mahatma Gandhi when he came to know of the saga of Netaji and the Indian National Army between 1943 and 1945. Have any questions? Let's take it from there are some ladies.
Good morning, sir. I thank you for re-enlightening Netaji in me that today I am
Please come to the question, please. Please.
Okay.
We have limited time.
Yeah, sure.
More people are there. Please come to your point.
Yeah, I would like to ask you a question that you talk about the three visions of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. Where does India stand in terms of fulfilling the three visions of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, being the education, being the poverty, and being India most democratic nation for today, sir? I would like to know from you.
Yes. Let's take the next question. I'll answer the two together. There was this lady there. Lady, let's have a gender balance in the questions. We should. Yeah. And
Good
there are
morning.
two women there.
A lot of mystery enshrouds Subhash Chandra Bose's death and its consequent prolonged investigation. I would want to know what are the implications of such investigation in the present day. This is one such question. And the second is, how do you think Subhash Chandra Bose would have responded to the political and economic changes of the day?
Let's take the third question and one more, and then I'll answer because they were.
A very good morning to you, sir. In her book, Democracy and Authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, Ayesha Jalal stated that out of all the Southeast Asian countries, India has been able to maintain the democratic fabric for the longest period. So in your opinion, I would like to know that given the means of Netaji, how far would he have been able to maintain this democratic fabric over the years? And how similar were his opinions to that of the Mahatma in maintaining it?
Thank you very much. First, in terms of the vision that he had for national defense, eradication of poverty, and provision of education for all, I think we have progressed in strengthening our national defense. We have also brought down poverty, even though it is by no means eradicated. But our biggest failure in the post-independence period was in the field of primary education and also providing primary health care. And even though I think in the 21st century we have made some advances in that sphere as well, Netaji would have been hugely disappointed to find that even, say, 50 years after independence, we were nowhere close to providing education for all. As to the second questioner, my view is that we really must focus on the life and work of Netaji. And the younger generation of Indians and Asians as a whole have still got a lot to learn from Netaji's book of life. There is no mystery about his mortal end. There were eyewitness accounts of what happened on the 18th of August 1945. There were 7 survivors of the crash of the military bomber. 6 out of 7 gave their evidence. In the 1950s, there were doctors, nurses, an interpreter who knew Netaji, who was brought to the hospital. So there is no mystery. I can understand that there was a mass psychological phenomenon in India in the 1950s and 1960s. People wanted him to return and solve the country's problems. But I think Gandhiji put it best in an article that he wrote for the Harijan on March 30th, 1946. He said that on the one hand, there was unsupported feeling that Netaji would return. And on the other hand, he had before him strong evidence of his mortal end. And I think we should follow Gandhiji and take inspiration from Netaji's life. If people simply said that we find it difficult to accept that he is no more, I would say that's fine. We can take a collective decision as a nation to only celebrate his birthday, as we do in our country. I'm perfectly fine with that. But the reason I believe that we ought to honor his martyr's death, as was put by another questioner, is that today, in the age of a lot of fake history and fake news, there are all kinds of absurd stories that are doing the rounds. For example, reducing Netaji to some Baba somewhere in northern India, which is a gross insult to the memory of the man whom I described in this lecture for you. Not only a man who made the supreme sacrifice for his country, but also somebody who had a grand vision for the future of India. So let's focus on his life. Let's not be distracted by the needless controversy and the non-existent mystery over his death. Netaji was, in fact, somebody deeply committed to democracy. And I quoted from one of his speeches that he gave to the Maharashtra Political Conference as its president in 1928, where he said democracy is a human institution. And what's more, he thought federalism in as diverse a country as ours has to be very much a key element of democracy. Now, there are 3 speeches or writings, I think, where he did say that initially we may need to have a strong central government, and once stability has been achieved, then more and more power and autonomy would be given to the regional governments. If we take the corpus of his works as a whole, his commitment to democracy, including federalism, was unquestioned. And that was the basis on which he was able to win the implicit trust of not only people belonging to the different religious communities, Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians. And Gandhiji acknowledged that no one else had the trust of everyone in the way that Netaji had. But he also had the support of people from all the regions of India. The professional soldiers in his Azad Hind Fauj were mostly from Punjab and the frontier province, but the civilian recruits were mostly from Tamil Nadu. And that's why I find that, he is admired even more in Punjab and Tamil Nadu, and I might even in Gujarat, the land of Mahatma Gandhi, than in his home province of Bengal. So I think he would have ensured that India prospered as a true and substantive democracy. He believed in socialism, but he always said that it had to be suited to Indian conditions. And he much preferred the old Buddhist Indian term, Samyavada, to encapsulate his ideology. Questions? Yeah.
Hello, good morning.
We'll come to you.
We'll come to you.
Yeah.
We'll come to you.
Any mistakes can you point out in the freedom struggle?
Please hold on.
Okay, I've got it.
We'll come to you, please.
Hello. So first thing, I just want to respond to him as Ramon being the father of modern India. I completely agree, because I am a Brahmo, so I'm
Yes.
probably the only person in the room who is a Brahmo. I want to just ask you a question. My maternal grandmother was not part of the INA. She was from East Bengal, and in the mid 1940s, there was some recruitment going on for for some training program. I do not know in English, lathi khela, chora khela, these kind of things. That was, that was trained to young women about 10, 12 years old, such that they could one day graduate to the INA. So my maternal grandmother was a huge fan of course, Netaji. She wanted to fight for the INA one day and go to Delhi, which was of course not possible. And after the partition of India, she had to come to Kolkata as a refugee, and then got married at a very young age. So my question is that, do you have any idea of these kind of village level training programs that was carried out under the supervision of the INA for young men and women to be able to graduate to the INA at some point in time? Thank you.
Well, these kinds of training programs for young men and women as well go back to the Swadeshi era of 1905. Sharala Devi Chaudhurani had started this particular process. What you're referring to probably are gatherings that were held in India during the enthusiasms over the Red Fort trial of November 1945, leading up to February 1946, when there was the naval mutiny in Bombay. At that time, boys and girls, young men and women, were all trying to imbibe the spirit of the Indian National Army, especially after Saigal Dhillon and Shah Nawaz had to be released, even after being sentenced to deportation for life. Now, Netaji had said, as Gandhiji acknowledged, that the INA in India must follow the non-violent path laid out by Mahatma Gandhi. So it's not so much what happened with girls or women inside India who later on were inspired by the INA example. What is, I think, more pertinent is that there were women who joined the Indian National Army in Southeast Asia. There were only a very few Bengalis there, but the majority of women who rallied to the INA happened to be from South India, particularly Tamils. The commander of the women's regiment was Lakshmi Swaminathan, who was a medical doctor. I have heard about the women's regiment also from another wonderful leader, Janaki Thevar Athinahappan, who said that she was so inspired by Netaji's speech in Kuala Lumpur that she rushed forward and gave her earrings to Netaji. And somebody took a photograph and published it in the local newspaper the next day. Her parents got to know. Now, here was someone who had not seen India and yet was so inspired that she went to Burma with the Indian National Army and was one of those who retreated on foot with Netaji when the tide of the war turned, and has left us a beautiful eyewitness account of how Netaji would not leave but would walk, because the women of the Rani of Jhansi regiment were with him. And this was made into a beautiful film after independence by, produced by Nazir Ahmed, which called Pehla Admi, about the first person who had laid down his life in the cause of freedom. So I think that's the context in which we should see women's participation in the INA. As for mistakes, I think a Himalayan blunder, if I may use Mahatma Gandhi's phrase, was made at the very climax of our independence struggle, when even the Congress leadership, following a call by the Hindu Mahasabha, decided to acquiesce in the partition of India along religious lines, which included the division of Punjab and Bengal, two provinces proud of their cultural and linguistic unity. Gandhiji tried his best to avert his catastrophe, but did not succeed. And I suggested only the other day at the Sabarmati ashram that, perhaps he missed his rebellious son and, had the saint and the warrior been able to work together, then we may have been able to prevent, that tragedy, which was a colossal human tragedy in 1947.
Hypothetical plane, if you are given any chance to rewind the clock of this thing, history, any action of Netaji which you would like to rewind, or ever he has ever regretted, that kind of thing?
Yes. There are critics of Netaji who have questioned his decision to ally with the Axis powers. He was very critical of fascism in Germany and also Japan's imperialist aggression in China. But he thought that for the cause of Indian and Asian independence during the Second World War, he had to side with the enemies of Britain and the British Empire. So there are two views on this matter. And here in India, we probably understand Netaji's choice much better than some of those who are in the Western world. In my view, he made one very major error of decision at the very end, which is that, he ought to have stayed either in Singapore or in Bangkok, where he was surrounded by his supporters in August of 1945. Wrongly advised by his cabinet, he took the riskiest option imaginable when he got on that aeroplane, which he described himself as an adventure into the unknown. Just imagine, in November 1945, when the British tried to put on trial 3 INA officers, 3 of his followers, the whole country rose in support of Netaji and the INA. It was just a matter of 3 months, August to November. So I think, it was a very stressful time. The atom bombs had just fallen. Japan had announced its surrender. So there wasn't very much time to take a very considered decision. But we lost him, India lost him, because of that particular risky decision. He took many risks in his life. Think about his escape from India or his submarine voyage. He had succeeded, but that was one risk too many. Yeah.
Yeah, gentleman in blue. Yeah, Francis, please. We'll take now 1 or 2 questions.
Sure.
Yeah, we'll have 2 more questions. And then
When he
The
died,
young man there and the young woman there.
Sure.
Yeah.
we'll come to you.
Yes.
when he died in Taipei, where was he headed?
Okay. May I take the 2 other questions together then
lady
for reasons of time? There's a young man there, the
Yeah.
lady there.
Yeah, okay.
Very good morning, sir. In context to the topic today, that his idols for modern India, Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Bose were prominent youth icons that led India to work together for a united India and to make sure that India is independent from the colonial rule. In context to that, what would be your opinion to the youth today that even the major thing that they should be thinking of is uniting India instead of pitting against each other, which is a major issue right now?
Okay. Shall I take the final question from that side?
Extreme. Yeah.
On that far left, yes.
Yeah.
Good. And then I'll come. Answer together.
Wait. Yeah. Your question.
My name is Keita Omi, political scientist. I'm just wondering which national archive would you go to? Are these pictures from your personal collection? I really enjoyed the talk. It was fascinating talk. But if I want to just do research about him, which national archive, or does Cambridge has a specific library, or Harvard has a specific collection about him, or If you can give me a suggestion, that would be great. Thank you so much.
You know, these photographs that you saw are all from the archives of the Netaji Research Bureau in Kolkata. It was set up by my father, Shishir Kumar Bose, who was a freedom fighter, pediatrician, but he also felt that he had to preserve the best traditions of the freedom struggle. So from 1957 onwards, he collected all of the letters, speeches, writings, photographs, voice recordings, film footage of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose, and there's a marvelous collection there. So these are taken from Netaji Research Bureau's collection. And where was he headed? The discussion in the Azad Hind cabinet was that perhaps he should try to get to Soviet-held Manchuria. The argument being that there was likely going to be a falling out between the British and the Americans on one side and the Russians on the other. Now, it wasn't very clear that he would be able to get to Soviet-held Manchuria, so the alternative backup was that at least if he could get to Japan, then some of his associates thought it was better to be apprehended by the Americans in Japan rather than by the British in Singapore, who might have shot him straight away and so on. So they wanted to avoid that risk. So he flew from Singapore to Bangkok, Bangkok to Saigon, then he was on a military bomber. One of the Japanese generals with him was General Shidei, who was fluent in both German and Russian, and whose ultimate destination was to Soviet-held Manchuria to try and negotiate with the Russians who had entered the war in August of 1945. General Shidei died in that air crash. There were 7 survivors, 7 who died as a consequence of the crash. So that was the general idea, basically, at that time. As for the question about the youth, you know, first of all, someone like Netaji had accepted the ideals of seva and tyag, service and sacrifice, very early on in his life. And those are ideals which are still relevant for the youth of India today. Think not only of self, but selflessness, what you can give to your fellow human beings. And when you talk about unity, I think the younger generation needs to consider very carefully what kind of unity do we want in India? Do we want to impose unity from above? Should we go for over-centralization? Or ought we to be following the ideals of Mahatma Gandhi and Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose? Gandhiji did not want a strong, modern, centralized state. If anything, he wanted India to live in the villages. He had a more atomistic view, a decentralized view of India. But he said that if you won the genuine article freedom in the villages, then the large-scale picture will fall into place. This is what he said in 1945-46, reflecting on what he had written in Hind Swaraj before. And Netaji, too, believed that you have to respect differences in a country as diverse as India, and therefore give a great deal of autonomy, and then rise above these differences to craft an overarching Indian unity. Rabindranath Tagore, who had a deep influence on Netaji, had written in his essay Bharatbarsha, where there is genuine difference, it is only by respecting that difference and then restraining in its proper place that you can achieve unity. You cannot accomplish the goal of unity by issuing legal fiats that everybody is one. So if we follow the ideals of these great figures, we might come to the conclusion that instead of a unitary India, a free and flexible federal union of India will, in the long term, be a much stronger union.
Can we take one more? Sure. Yeah, gentleman in the middle. Yeah, that will be the last question. Yeah, please. That gentleman, please. You can talk after.
Sir, we have learned from you that his was a death, and India accepts it very heavy heart. I only want to know, as a family member of Netaji and as a historian, what do you think? Was it an accident or a target crash of the plane? Am I clear?
Well, I always am a bit reluctant to speak as a family member of Netaji. That's because Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose always used to say that my family and country are coterminous. And so if I'm a member of Netaji's family, so are all of you sitting in the audience. But as a historian, I have looked at the evidence, and sadly, tragically, I have concluded that the crash took place, that he died, that was his mortal end. He is immortal in a much deeper sense. It is very hard to say definitively whether it was an accident or it was something deliberate, because, this was a crash that took place on takeoff. It would appear that it was an accident. The left propeller fell off for some reason. But Habibur Rahman, who was his only Indian companion on that plane journey, said that he heard a loud noise, and initially he thought that the aeroplane had been shot at. But he could not be sure. Now, he survived, and he is the prime witness of what happened. Since he came from the other side of Punjab, he went to Pakistan, but he was alive until the 1980s, and he maintained the same account of what happened until the day that he passed away. So that was a deep tragedy, but I do want to end by saying, particularly to so many young people who have come to hear me speak today, that please do concentrate on his life and work. Learn from his ideas, follow them. Don't be distracted by all these kinds of fabricated stories. Study his life, follow his ideas, and all of you then will be paying a genuine tribute to Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose and be able to build the India of his dreams.
Just 2 minutes. So thank you, Dr. Sugata Bose. I think that was the master advice. Last few word was the masterpiece of the input. So before we conclude, I think on the behalf of, yeah, sorry. No, you carry on. Yeah. So before we conclude today's session, on behalf of Ahmedabad Management Association, we would like to just have a small memento memory to you, Dr. So as standard formality, it's a thank you note to all of you on behalf of AMA coming in a big number. And I think just remember all the depth of presentation and take it forward, all the learning. So with this, I conclude today's session. Thank you so much to all of you coming in a big number. Thank you.